Out of the blue, my 9-year-old son was diagnosed with pediatric cancer. He had been complaining of persistent fatigue, and although I suspected it was more than just tiredness, I never imagined it would be cancer. From that day, he was forced to start a difficult treatment and hospitalization. You think it's just laziness, right? You're just trying to gain sympathy by claiming it's something as serious as pediatric cancer. How attention-seeking can you be? Even when I told my husband about our son's illness, he didn't take it seriously. He kept saying he was too busy with work and never once visited our son in the hospital. My mother-in-law insisted that household chores were a wife's duty and did nothing but complain. Then one day, my husband and mother-in-law, who had never visited before, showed up in our son's hospital room. You know, cancer can be cured with vitamins. What? There are tons of testimonials online about miraculous cancer cures with vitamins. There's this one about stage 4 cancer disappearing in a week. So I'll cure our son's cancer. He grabbed the orange juice our son was drinking and poured it over his head. I'm off to a spa trip with your mother for a week. Make sure you're cured by the time we're back. Both my son and I were speechless with disbelief. As soon as they left the room, my son, freed from his fear, broke down crying. Cure cancer with vitamins? What nonsense! And who pours liquid over a sick person like that? Fueled by an unbelievable anger, I resolved to seek revenge on them. As a result, a shocking truth awaited them when they returned a week later. I married my first husband at 26. He was 4 years older and had been my tutor when I was studying for school exams. We reconnected as colleagues at the same company. And gradually started talking about the future, leading to our marriage. The following year, our son was born. Just when we thought we were starting a new chapter as a family, my first husband passed away from an illness. Despite feeling unwell, he had delayed seeing a doctor due to work. One day, he collapsed at work and was later diagnosed with cancer. He began treatment immediately, but the disease progressed rapidly, and he passed away 3 months later. Years later, I remarried my current husband. At first, I was worried about how my son would get along with a stepfather. However, my husband and son gradually grew closer, and one day, my son asked if he could call him Dad. Surprised, my husband and I realized that was our answer and decided to get married. The meeting with my in-laws went smoothly, and they adored my son as their own grandson. While my husband was marrying for the first time, I was remarrying, so we had a wedding ceremony and reception with close family and friends. It was a warm and heartening event, despite the joke I made with a friend about having a wedding ceremony twice. On the surface, my husband's family seemed happy, but things were different on the inside. My husband had a younger brother who was married and living with the in-laws. My husband, having moved out for work, always said he never thought of marriage. His brother, being more serious, had decided to take over the family home and was living there with his wife. My mother-in-law didn't get along with my sister-in-law and always complained about her. I didn't want to take sides. I didn't want to make a judgment based solely on my mother-in-law's side of the story, but at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to ask my sister-in-law directly about the real situation. I just nodded along and mostly ignored my mother-in-law's constant complaints. But maybe that wasn't the best approach, as she started spending more and more time at our house. She found excuses to stay overnight, and before I knew it, she was practically living with us half the month. Eventually, she even started bringing her personal belongings and settled in for good. She became increasingly overbearing, acting like she owned the place. At first, she seemed like a kind and understanding mother-in-law to me and my son. But gradually, it became clear she was engaging in the classic mother-in-law bullying. Before I remarried, I worked part-time, supported partly by my late husband's inheritance. Even after remarrying, I continued working part-time to contribute to our finances. Considering my son's future, having more money is definitely better. But my mother-in-law started implying that my husband's earnings were insufficient and urged me to quit my job. After all, you're a mother. You should prioritize raising your child. I never neglected my son because of my job. We had been managing just fine. Then she started making snide remarks to my son. It's because of you that your mother struggles. Your new dad must be embarrassed by you. She even forced him to do schoolwork meant for middle schoolers, way beyond his grade level. He's still at an age where he hasn't even learned the basics, and yet they're making him do middle school level workbooks. Of course, he couldn't answer a single question and ended up crying. She would take away his meals, complaining about his crying and saying, "Boys shouldn't cry so much." My son began to fear her and avoided being alone with her. What an unlovable kid. It's because he lacks a mother's love that he's not adorable. What kind of upbringing is this? She would say within earshot of my son, making him apologize to me often. It must have been heartbreaking for him to think he was the cause of my troubles. I couldn't confront her directly because she would take it out on my son. But I couldn't stay silent, considering my son's well-being. When my husband, who was often away for work, came home, I told him everything. But my husband said that his mother would never say such things and certainly wouldn't do anything terrible to the children, completely dismissing what I said. My mom would never say or do such things to a child. Are you sure you're not being too harsh on her? What? She's complained about you not doing your household duties properly. We can live on my salary alone, so focus on your household responsibilities. I was accused of forcing housework on my aging mother-in-law, something completely foreign to me. I never demanded her to do any chores. In fact, I'd never seen her lift a finger around the house. She just sat there, ordering me around. She complained about the food but never showed me how she preferred it to be cooked. I'm not a mind reader. How am I supposed to know a taste I've never experienced? I wanted to retort so many times, but always held back, fearing my son would become her target. Gradually, my husband also started to become cold and indifferent towards me and our son. Even that indifference would have been bearable if it were just that. Sometimes, he'd suddenly lose his temper as if possessed by another personality. Though he never hit us, he'd throw things, and one time something hit my son. My son was crying in pain and fear, and my husband just told him to stop crying and dragged him outside to the yard. I stood up for my son, blocking him with my body. I thought my husband would hit me, but instead, he said he was turned off by the situation and lost interest, which somehow diffused the situation. I guess he must be stressed from work. Believing he would return to his kind self once he calmed down, I decided to endure it, all the while being ready to protect my son from any harm. In the midst of these unimproving relationships with my husband and mother-in-law, my son turned 9. He loved basketball and had started attending a class for elementary school kids organized by an adult basketball team. Having something he was passionate about and less time facing my mother-in-law made him visibly happier. Then one day, he started feeling unwell. I thought he had just overexerted himself in basketball, so I let him skip class, but his condition didn't improve even after a week. In fact, it seemed to get worse. I took him to the pediatrician who had been looking after him since he was little, and they suggested we go to a larger hospital for thorough testing. I knew nothing about big hospitals, having never been sick or injured, except when my late first husband was treated. The pediatrician, having connections, wrote us a referral. He urged us to go as soon as possible, preferably the next day. I later learned that without a referral, there's an extra charge for the first visit at a big hospital. I was relieved we had the doctor's help, but terrified that my son might have a serious illness. When I told my husband, I asked him to come with us, but he refused. It's probably just him faking it. Did something happen at school? If you believe every little thing a kid says, no amount of money will be enough. Big hospitals are expensive, right? You handle it with your part-time earnings. I've heard that children sometimes use fake illnesses to rebel against their parents. But would a child use a fake illness to reduce their appetite? And would they continue that state for an entire week? Even adults who fast to make a statement find a week quite lengthy. It requires more than ordinary resolve to do so. Anyway, my son's illness lasting a week definitely meant something was wrong. I had no problem paying with my part-time earnings and declared to my husband that I would take our son by myself. He just said, "Do whatever you want," and was quite grumpy that evening. The next day at the hospital, they prepared for the worst-case scenario. "What's the worst case?" I asked the doctor. "Pediatric cancer," he replied. He mentioned symptoms like not being able to differentiate it from a cold, abdominal pain, and sudden weight loss, and asked if I had noticed anything. Then my son revealed that his joints had been hurting for a while. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. He said he didn't want to worry me more or have my husband and mother-in-law say bad things to me because of him. I felt terrible that he was suffering but still concerned about me. If I had been handling things better with my husband and mother-in-law, maybe I would have noticed my son's discomfort sooner. Or realized something was off with him keeping quiet. As I was reflecting on my shortcomings, another shock came. My son's illness was an early symptom of pediatric cancer. He needed to be hospitalized, and while preparing for it, I told my husband and mother-in-law. "Pediatric cancer? A money-draining failure of a kid. I'm not paying a single cent. Cancer is hereditary, isn't it? Your first husband died of cancer, right? Great, now we've inherited something extra," my husband coldly remarked. It was heartless. Treating a disease costs a lot. Especially cancer, which requires a significant amount for treatment. My mother-in-law seemed only worried about the financial aspect. In response, my husband said in front of me that my son's treatment costs would be covered by my part-time earnings, so there was no problem. I couldn't stand being around these insensitive people any longer, so I hurried back to the hospital where my son was waiting. He had to give up the basketball he loved so much and his enjoyable school life to focus on his treatment. Thankfully, the pediatric ward had a school, so he wouldn't fall behind in his studies. But the reality of seeing other children, who seemed to be having a tougher time, shocked him. Will I end up like that? Will I never be able to play basketball again? I wanted to become a famous basketball player and make things easier for you, Mom. He lamented, feeling like he was constantly burdening me. I was told that the way we handle our emotions can affect his condition, so I was careful not to add to his stress. I never blamed him, but maybe my concern showed on my face. Did I unconsciously emit an aura that made him anxious? I had to change my mindset and support and encourage my son, who was becoming increasingly disheartened. There were times when my son, overwhelmed by his illness, cried out in despair, saying he didn't care about getting better anymore and just wanted to die. The side effects of the treatment were so severe and unbearable that it seemed like he couldn't endure them any longer. Cancer treatment can be so tough that even adults struggle with it. I thought I understood the difficulties of cancer treatment from my late husband's experience, but he passed away without undergoing much treatment. In reality, I only thought I knew about it, but I didn't truly understand the extent of it. It's easy to say, but it's another thing to do it. To support my son, I sought advice from those who had been through it. Thanks to being at a university hospital, I was introduced to a student who had experienced pediatric cancer. Listening to their story about what words hurt and what words were comforting. It was incredibly helpful. My son and I were both struggling with his illness, but we were determined to work towards his recovery. Yet, my husband and mother-in-law never visited. Honestly, their presence might have made us feel worse. But a little concern when I went home for my son's clothes would have been nice. Back to the hospital again? Aren't you my wife? What are you doing, neglecting your home for this? It was the kind of response I'd get when I did hear from my husband. Whether at the hospital or home, I never got a moment's peace. I was constantly on edge, barely holding on with sheer willpower. Amidst all this, my father-in-law was the only one who regularly visited. His concern for my son and me, along with his light-hearted conversations, allowed us to forget our harsh reality for a while. I couldn't be more grateful to him. It was also heartening to see my son, who usually looked so downcast, smile more when his grandfather was around. My father-in-law had confided in me that he had lost a close friend to cancer. And having seen the burden on the family and the struggle of his friend, he wanted to help us in any way he could. Just knowing he felt that way was enough for me. I sometimes wished that my husband and mother-in-law would show even a tenth of the compassion my father-in-law did. But expecting anything from them only led to deeper disappointment, so I stopped expecting anything at all. One day, my mother-in-law and husband, who had shown no interest in my son's fight against illness, came to his hospital room. "How long do you plan to run away from home like a rebellious teenager? The house is a mess because you're not there. A wife has her duties, right? Everyone dies eventually, so just leave him be. Cancer recovery is just a matter of luck, isn't it, T? Cancer recovery? A matter of luck? Everyone dies eventually? What are they even talking about? Is that something to say in a ward full of people fighting for their lives?" I was so enraged and appalled that I lost my composure. "Isn't there a right time and place to say certain things? Haven't you, who have lived many times longer than my son, learned that yet? Maybe you too should get a brain scan. Sometimes a tumor in the brain can twist a person's personality." I vaguely remembered a medical drama with a similar plot. I said it confidently, hoping to scare them a bit. "Are you insulting the mother who raised me? Your son's weak and cancer-ridden state is a result of your poor upbringing, right? Cancer can be instantly cured by vitamins. I read about it on the internet. So I'll cure him," my husband said, and then poured my son's orange juice over his head. It was an action so beyond my imagination that I couldn't intervene. My son and I were too shocked to react immediately and could only stand there dumbfounded. My husband and mother-in-law laughed at us, pointing their fingers. "We're going on a trip. If your stupid son's illness isn't cured by the time we get back, you don't know what we might do. Remember that. Make sure you clean up the house by the time we get back from our trip." They commanded and left the room. Once they were gone, the tension broke, and my son burst into tears out of fear. Nurses rushed in upon hearing the commotion, busying themselves with cleaning and changing the sheets. My son and I had to wait in an empty room. I apologized to my son for the fact that what should have been the most comforting place, his home, had become his greatest source of fear. I regretted my naivety in thinking that reducing contact with my mother-in-law might help, and apologized for the years of enduring this situation. My son, kind-hearted as always, comforted me, saying that he had endured my mother-in-law's meanness just like I had. I vowed to take such revenge on my husband and mother-in-law that they would never recover. A week after making this vow, my husband called me. "Hey! Why can't I get into my own house? What kind of wife locks out her husband? Who do you think provides for you?" He yelled through the phone, his voice piercing even with the volume turned down. When did that house become his? It was inherited from my late first husband. My husband suggested we start our married life in my house, saying his apartment lease was about to expire. He promised that eventually, we would get a new place, but there was never any sign of that happening. In the end, he just casually moved in without any real commitment to finding us a new home. Before I remarried, I was approached by an acquaintance of my late husband, offering to buy the house. The offer was above market value, and it was tempting. I thought we would move to a new home after marrying, and my husband might find it uncomfortable living in a house associated with my late husband. The acquaintance even offered to pay the amount I wanted for the well-located and well-designed house. However, I couldn't part with the memories of my late husband and didn't sell it. I told them we could discuss it again when the time comes. But my husband never brought up the subject of a new house, and my mother-in-law settled in as if it were the most natural thing, leading to the current situation. I suddenly remembered someone saying that memories aren't tangible things. Now, I finally understand that memories reside in a person's mind. It's actually quite late for me to realize this. I should have let go of the house when my mother-in-law first started to stay over. When I reached out to my late husband's acquaintance to discuss selling the house, albeit belatedly, he was happy to proceed. He even apologized for bringing up the sale during my time of grief. The sale procedures were already completed. He was considerate about my moving out and my son's illness, agreeing to schedule the handover at my convenience. I was grateful, but to truly take revenge on my husband and mother-in-law, I quickly moved out. I sent their belongings to my in-laws' house, paying the shipping fees myself. My son and I took only the essentials and had already moved to our new place. When my husband kept insisting it was his house, I reminded him that it was inherited from my late husband, thus it was mine. He was momentarily taken aback but quickly retaliated. "Even if that's true, you had no right to make such a decision without consulting me. After all, I was the one paying for the maintenance of that house." Living in a house inevitably leads to some wear and tear, like issues with water flow or the toilet not functioning properly. His argument was nonsensical, asserting ownership because he paid for some repairs. I ignored his rationale and declared my intention to divorce him. My mother-in-law, who had been eavesdropping, intervened. "What an ungrateful woman! Accepting you as a wife with your baggage, and now you want a divorce? Women like you are just a nuisance wherever they go. I'm telling you I'll disappear from your lives, which should make you happy. Why won't you agree to the divorce? I thought you'd be celebrating. Be honest about your feelings." Stung by the truth, my mother-in-law fell silent and didn't retort. But that didn't mean I had the upper hand. I needed to be cautious and not show any weaknesses. When selling the house, my late husband's acquaintance showed concern about the sudden decision. I confessed that I had planned to sell the house once I found a new place with my current husband. The delay was due to my husband dragging his feet and my mother-in-law's imposing presence. I had given up on fixing my relationship with my mother-in-law long ago. I had hoped my husband would return to the man he was when we met, which led to my indecisiveness. The acquaintance sympathized with my situation and introduced me to a competent lawyer. The lawyer was very supportive and said we should divorce for the happiness of my son and me. I proceeded with the divorce through the lawyer, and my husband eventually agreed to it. The reason for my late husband's acquaintance's kindness was that he was an executive in a company, and one of their clients was the company where my husband worked. Moreover, my husband was the manager in charge of that account. When the acquaintance requested a change in the representative, my husband's bosses interrogated him about any misconduct. The client company was important, and they didn't want to lose them. However, my husband denied any wrongdoing. His superiors, who had heard unfavorable rumors about him, conducted an internal investigation. It was revealed that my husband, along with my mother-in-law, had been treating my son terribly. Apparently, my husband had been spreading rumors among his subordinates and colleagues, saying that his stepchild was weak, stupid, and useless. My husband had been bragging to his colleagues and subordinates about how he had poured orange juice over my son's head because he supposedly had pediatric cancer. "I'm awesome for doing that," he boasted. A suspicious subordinate checked the website my husband mentioned, which turned out to be a dubious online store claiming that cancer could be cured with vitamins. Recently, the news reported that the site's operator had been arrested after many victims came forward. It was one of those organizations selling miracle water at a high price. When called in by his boss, my husband was defiant. "What does this have to do with the company? What I do to the kid doesn't affect my work." He even bragged about how he had been treating my son, claiming it was just discipline. The company pointed out that his behavior was too far removed from common decency and too risky to continue employing him in today's society, leading to his dismissal. Later, my husband heard a rumor from a former subordinate that the executive of the client company knew me. In reality, the acquaintance was a friend of my late husband, but rumors often get twisted. Panicked, my husband came to me for help, showing up at my workplace, which was nothing but a nuisance. Apparently, my late husband's acquaintance had been making things difficult for my ex-husband's re-employment. Even without the acquaintance's intervention, the reason for leaving his last job would have to be explained. Being fired usually implies a significant reason. I told my desperate husband, who had only come to me when in trouble, that he was reaping what he sowed, and sent him away. My mother-in-law returned to her marital home nonchalantly, but she no longer had a place there. When I decided to divorce my husband, I made sure to tell everything to my father-in-law, who had always been kind to my son. He was deeply hurt and outraged that even his young grandson had been targeted. Additionally, the fact that my sister-in-law had also been mistreated by her came to light, leading my father-in-law to finally lose all patience with her. When my mother-in-law returned to the house as if it were her right, my father-in-law told her they were getting a divorce. Initially reluctant, she changed her mind, thinking it better to receive alimony than to live with a disliked daughter-in-law and a disenchanted husband. However, instead of receiving alimony, she ended up being the one who had to pay it. My sister-in-law demanded compensation for the mental distress caused by her. My ex-husband, who had been staying at the house as a temporary arrangement, was also kicked out after my father-in-law discovered his cruel treatment of me and my son. My mother-in-law now lives in a cheap apartment, seemingly rotting away with my ex-husband. He struggles to find steady employment, resorting to day-to-day labor to make ends meet. My mother-in-law, having been a housewife for many years, refuses to work, leading to constant fights between the two. They blame each other, and their quarrels are so loud that they've received police warnings for noise complaints several times. In reality, both are to blame. My mother-in-law instigated the issues, and my husband was complicit by participating. Given her rotten nature, she seems likely to survive stubbornly, regardless of how low her living conditions fall. After everything was settled, my father-in-law visited my son. And I once apologized deeply for what his wife and son had done. He hoped for our future happiness and discreetly offered me some money as compensation for the trouble caused. I initially refused, but he insisted, saying he couldn't be there until my son's full recovery, so I gratefully accepted. Following the divorce, my son began to feel relieved from the fear of my mother-in-law and husband, and his mental state started stabilizing. Being able to take a positive outlook, his condition improved, as noted by his doctor. Setting goals for himself, he stopped complaining about the tough treatments. His efforts paid off, and he was granted temporary discharge from the hospital. If there are no issues, we can gradually return to normal life while continuing the treatment. Soon, his condition becomes more stable. Though there are restrictions, he can start attending school again. He might still need occasional hospitalization, but it's no longer for extended periods like before. My son is setting goals for himself, like things he wants to do and foods he wants to eat once he's discharged and after the treatment ends, all aiming towards complete recovery. The school has been understanding about his illness, and many students are genuinely kind to him, which gives me peace of mind when sending him off to school. I feel relieved and happy seeing him slowly but surely showing signs of recovery. Moving forward, I am determined to work hand in hand with my son to grasp even greater happiness.